Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I am, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we are going to cover specifically Steve Duck's phase model of relationship breakdown. On an earlier episode, we talked about the growth and navigation phase of relationships. And so on today's episode, we're going to solely focus on the deterioration phase of relationships. Some key terms to look out for and think about are, of course, going to be the intrapsychic phase, didactic breakdown, social phase, and grave dressing. Of course, after covering these concepts, we'll delve into our Ask Dr. Shepard for the week. If you'd like to submit your own question or comment or concern for Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So when we think about Stephen Duck, who is a social psychologist's phase model of relationship breakdown, we of course are going to start with the first phase, which is the intrapsychic stage. And I might mess up that word. It's a tongue twister for me sometimes. And so during this stage is when a person has to admit to themselves that they are dissatisfied with their relationship, that they are spending a lot of time thinking about the reasons for this dissatisfaction and possibly ways to move forward. This stage usually focuses on one's own internal thought processes that occur before confronting the partner. So before a person moves to that next stage of that didactic breakdown, they reach a threshold of thinking, I can't stand this anymore. I can't do this anymore. When I think about the intrapsychic stage, I definitely think about the relational dialectics that we have discussed in an earlier episode. So just a brief refresher, relational dialectics are opposing tensions that occur in any relationship. The three most common are autonomy versus connection, which looks at being separate versus being together. There's novelty versus predictability. That means doing things that are familiar versus doing things spontaneously, right? And then we have openness versus closeness, which is being transparent versus being private. When we think about these relational dialectics, these are tensions that are ongoing in any interpersonal relationship. So especially they are going to occur in a committed romantic relationship. And when you've been in a committed romantic relationship for a prolonged period of time, you often get comfortable in a rhyme and a routine. So I think about that novelty versus predictability, that novelty of doing things spontaneous or new versus predictability, the familiar routine. I know for myself, Fridays, as I've shared before, are pizza Fridays. So that is a predictability that occurs. And when I was in a committed romantic relationship, if we were together on Fridays, we of course would have pizza. But how we navigated that was we'd make our pizza sometimes. We'd order from different places. We would try different ways of making the pizza sometimes as well. Detroit style, flat crust, thin crust, right? All this different ways so that it didn't just become the same thing over and over every Friday. This is also why I think a lot of long-term committed romantic relationships oftentimes talk about having date nights still scheduled so that they can have this novelty in their relationship, and they're not going to go to the same restaurant every week or every other week or once a month. They're going to try new restaurants or try new things. And this is a way that you can potentially avoid that tension of just falling into that rut. But of course, dissatisfaction just doesn't have to revolve around the spontaneity versus familiarity. It can also maybe revolve around connection versus separation, that autonomy versus connection. Maybe now someone is frustrated that, yes, while we're together and hanging out a lot and all the time, if you live with each other, maybe the other person is often on their phone. You don't like that. They're not present when you are with them. we think about openness versus closeness, maybe they are being more open with very close friends about things that are happening in their lives, and you feel a type of way because you're their committed romantic partner, and you believe as if they should feel confident or comfortable coming and sharing these issues with you. Maybe you feel like they're withholding information. So you reach that point internally where you can't stand this anymore. Additionally, there's this concept called gunnysacking that comes up that might also lead to the didactic breakdown. So gunnysacking, it's literally the first time I remember learning in interpersonal communication all the way back when I was an undergrad at Northwestern. And gunnysacking basically is something bothers you about your partner, but you don't say anything. You just hold it in. But one day, that sack that you've been putting all those grievances in explodes. So maybe your issue is your partner never puts their coat up. They just leave it on the chair by the door. You put it away. You just like, okay, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. But that growing resentment eventually boils over that maybe they left a sink in the dish and you explode over that and they don't know where that's coming from. And so now you're throwing all of this tension that you've kept, and that can lead eventually to the didactic breakdown. So it can be around more complex things like those relational dialectics. It can be around your partner maybe doesn't do something and it's not that big of a deal. I shouldn't let quote unquote roommate issues impact the relationship. But because you're not talking to them about it, because you're not sharing it with them, you're holding it in. And so what that then leads to sometimes is that didactic breakdown. So the didactic breakdown phase occurs when romantic partners gradually stop engaging in their established patterns, understandings, and the routines that make up their relational culture. So maybe you are the partner that wakes up earlier and you get the coffee machine going because you both enjoy coffee. I, for one, do not drink coffee. Never really got into the taste of it, but I do understand that it is something that a lot of people use to get their days going. It reminds me, of course, of I want to say 2002 film Brown Sugar, one of my personal favorites. And we actually see a didactic breakdown occur with one of those couples where one of them always makes the coffee for the other partner, and then she kind of stops doing that, which is a sign that something is wrong in the relationship. And so if partners choose not to talk about these changes in their patterns and understandings, and they deny these problems that they're experiencing, they're clearly in that didactic phase. This occurs a lot where people are complaining to one another. There's dissatisfaction. We might also be rethinking alternatives to our current relationship. And the threshold at this stage is I would be justified in withdrawing. So you start withdrawing. So up to this point, through the intrapsychic stage and the didactic breakdown potentially stage, couples are generally keeping their dissatisfactions private. At the next phase, though, you start to involve friends and relatives, and you make your distress more public. So this is the social phase of the relationship breakdown. According to Duck, once this conflict in your relationship reaches this social stage and phase, it becomes more difficult for a couple to mend their relationship because clearly friends, family, maybe close coworkers are going to take sides. They're going to want to intervene in your relationship and offer advice, whether solicited or not. And I know I used to be the king of unsolicited advice, though trying to be more ethical and effective with my communication, I always now try to take a step back and ask, well, would you like my thoughts? Would you like my opinions? Or do you just want to vent? So once this threshold hits, it usually leads to the disillusionment of the relationship. The reason being is you have now opened up your relationship for everyone else to offer opinions. These observers are going to give you wisdom. They might be team stay together. They might be team breakup. And while you might be now trying to maneuver or figure these issues out with your partner, you now have a host of other people that are invested in figuring out, well, what did you do? How did you make it work? Are you not making it work? What did they do today? How's it going? They're checking the temperature. And so while you and your partner might be trying to move forward, whatever the issue is in your relationship, it becomes a lot harder once you welcome other people in who are not going to be objective. They are going to try and push you in a direction or not. So maybe your friend never liked your long-term partner. So now that they're aware that there's trouble on the horizon, they might try and push you to a breakup, even though that might not be what's best for you. So I would caution those who are maybe going through some of these phases to really reconsider opening up and talking to others about your relationship. And if you are going to talk to them, figure out if they can be unbiased. Usually most people cannot be, but if they can be unbiased, that maybe that is the ideal person to talk to. Also, once you open up your relationship, personal problems and dissatisfactions to your friends, to your family, they are going to look at you and or your partner a little differently, and that might last forever. For instance, if your partner cheated on you and you're trying to figure out if you want to stay or not, your close friends and family are probably going to forever look sideways at your partner. And they also might look a little sideways at you because you've decided to stay. If that was one of your non-negotiables, your shall not rules, they're going to be like, well, you've said that you wouldn't stay, so why are you staying? So I would always caution, if we're trying to be ethical and effective with our communication, that if you have moved from the intrapsychic phase and are in that didactic breakdown, that you actually talk to your partner. And if you need someone to help you with that, this is where maybe couples counseling comes in. This is where relationship coaches or life coaches might also be helpful if they're unbiased and can help you maybe smooth over or work through those problems. Maybe this is also a point to have that meta communication, that communication about communication talk with your partner. How can we bring up our dissatisfactions with one another in a productive way? How can we move forward with these? I would argue that most people who are in committed romantic relationships want to stay in those committed romantic relationships. So communication can be a great way to hopefully alleviate these issues and work through these issues before bringing other people in. But once you hit that social phase, it does become very hard to move past that. And if you do hit the social phase, you then might move either into the grave dressing phase or the resurrection process. So grave dressing is where you bury the relationship and accept that it's come to a close. You and your partner need to justify to yourselves and others why the relationship ended. And usually you create stories, whether based in truth or imagined truth, as to why the relationship is over. So whether you want to come off as mature or a wounded bird, or that you walked away learning a lot of useful lessons, most people tell themselves different stories so that they seem as if they left in a good light and it won't negatively impact their future relationship prospects. If you hit this grave dressing phase, right, you're mourning the loss of the relationship. It's time to start a new life. So the social phase is going to definitely add a lot of pressure and it's a lot harder to come back from. But then we do know that if you don't come back from it, clearly it's the grave dressing phase. And I think about with grave dressing, right? It's buried. You're decorating. You're trying to figure out, how do I move forward? But if for some reason, and sometimes we do see this work, I'm reminded of a pop culture example with the social phase. If you've ever watched Married to Medicine, there is Dr. Simone and her husband Cecil. They were very public about issues in their marriage with their group of friends, and their group of friends were very much invested in their relationship and them working it out. And both of them have talked on the show how their relationship was at the brink of ending due to miscommunication, due to mistrust that could have been resolved if they spoke up a little earlier. Luckily for them, Their friendship, their community rallied behind them, and they are still happily married today as the show is still airing and they seem very happy. They were able to not enter into the grave dressing phase. They therefore removed themselves from the resurrection phase. And so this is a phase added on that extends the model. The model usually was just those four: the psychic process phase, the didactic process or didactic breakdown phase, the social process phase, and the grave dressing phase. So the model has actually been extended with Duck's colleague Rowley to include that after the relationship is over, usually both parties achieve personal growth. So during this resurrection phase, individuals may develop a new sense of self-identity, one that maybe involves lessons learned from previous relationship. At this phase, the individual may choose to publicly talk about their disillusionment or dissolved relationship as an experience that made them stronger, wiser, and further, they may reflect on the lessons learned from this past relationship and use them as insight to develop new senses of purpose and direction in their life. So doing so, they turn this negative experience into a source of empowerment and growth. Now, not everyone reaches that resurrection phase. Sometimes people stay and wallow in that grave dressing process, but ideally, as we become more ethical and effective with our communication and gain a better sense of self, because we're not only communicating better with others, but we're communicating better with ourselves, we will move into the resurrection phase of the breakdown of a relationship, right? The relational disillusionment phases for Duck occur pretty straightforward and pretty standard, and unless there is something or someone that breaks you out of those, as we discussed a few examples, Duck argues that relationships pretty much stem and follow this in a pretty neat, linear way. Now, some people have called out Duck, or not necessarily called out, but have more complicated Duck's different phases. So we know, for instance, that with the social phase, when you're alerting relatives that your relationship is no longer maybe working or there are issues, people have argued that we tend to see age being a factor in people maybe getting involved. So if this is kind of puppy love, teenagers, maybe even young college relationships, that people maybe won't put as much effort into trying to reconcile the partners versus older couples who are seen in distress, where people are going to really rally behind them. So that Married to Medicine episode, right? That couple had been together for well over 20 years. Of course, their friends are going to rally behind them. But if you hit the social phase in your relationship and you've only been dating a few months or maybe a year or so, maybe not as many people are going to rally behind. Another issue that some people, or debate that people have brought up regarding Duck's phase model, is that the model is focused very much on individualistic cultures where relationship ending is a voluntary choice and separation and divorce are easily obtainable and do not carry much stigma. However, if we think about a lot of collectivist cultures where relationships maybe are arranged by wider family members or are characterized by greater family involvement, that sometimes makes the relationship a little more difficult to end, and that breakup process becomes a little more complicated. Therefore, some might argue that Duck's model isn't as culturally sensitive as one would assume, because no breakup process is universal. And of course, as I've always said and shared with my students, and on this podcast we've talked about before, that communication is content, context, and communicator specific. Therefore, no one way of going about a breakup or seeing how a breakup dissolves is going to fit everyone. So maybe, for instance, if we think about these phases and the linear model in which they were outlined, the intrapsychic phase into the didactic breakdown phase, into the social phase, into the grave dressing phase, well, it might switch up or change a bit. So maybe you actually have some didactic breakdown before you enter into that intrapsychic phase. Maybe some patterns and routines are breaking down, and then that causes you to think about your relationship and reconsider it. Or maybe you're talking about those breakdowns, right? Those didactic breakdowns in the social phase with people. And then talking with them gets you to think about intimately that intrapsychic phase. So I would say these are different aspects, but how they come to be might be different based on your cultural values, based on how you engage with your own interpersonal relationships. I know, for instance, when I ended my relationship, I didn't really talk to anybody about it. I announced, of course, that the relationship was over, and I told them why, because I was very mindful and aware of the social phase with my work, that if I let people in to what was happening, that they were going to have opinions, they were going to be checking in on me, asking me what was going on, what I was doing. And so I blocked out that noise and never entered into that phase. So we also know that sometimes people can skip phases and move into other phases. And one thing that I do want to highlight before we move into Ask Dr. Shepard is going back to grave dressing. I know one of my close friends is dealing with that now, where these stories that people are going to tell, whether based in truth or imagined truth, are going to happen. And I know that she was struggling with the fact that, well, people are going to think I did this or I did that, and that's not the truth. And what I told her, and what I want to share with you all today as well, is that you shouldn't worry about what other people are going to think about what has happened with your relationship. I know it's easier said than done, but once you get to a place of self-fulfillment and self-identity, you'll realize that those that understand you or want to understand you or believe in who you are or what you do, what's in your norms, what's not in your norms, are going to understand that, oh, this is a made-up story someone is telling, because that's not the person that I know. That's not their integrity. That's not their morals. That's not their values. And those that are committed to misunderstanding you, those that are maybe looking for a reason to not like you, are going to believe that imagined truth. And there's nothing you could ever say or do to change that. So sometimes in the grave dressing phase, people focus on, well, what's this imagined truth, or what's their truth, or what's the lies that they're going to say to make themselves look better. And ultimately, that relationship is in your past. And I would argue that's more so your ego coming out, trying to think and discuss these issues that no longer matter, because people who don't like you or want a reason not to like you are going to believe the imagined truth or the lies or that person's quote unquote version of events. But the people who love you, who care about you, who you're actually in community with, who know you, are going to care to hear your side. If they've heard the other side, they're either going to care to hear it. One, two, they might not believe it and not even bring it to your attention because they know who you genuinely are. Or three, they probably haven't heard it and are only going to focus on you and your healing during this time. When we think about grave dressing, yes, we might think about, well, what are they saying to justify how they treated me or why the relationship ended, depending on why it ended. But ultimately, focus on you and your well-being. Sure, maybe they're acting as if they were the wounded bird, but that person was actually the one hurting you. That person was manipulating you. That person was being unethical with their communication or manipulating you. But of course, nobody wants to come off as that, especially for their future relationship prospects. So they're going to craft a tale. But you're no longer part of their lives. And as people have shared on social media and in other works around interpersonal communication and relationships, we're all somebody's villain, whether we genuinely are or not, whether we have actually done things to justify that imagined truth or that idea of us. We all are somebody's saint and we all are somebody's sinner or villain. So you need to move on through that and reach that resurrection process where you can come out stronger, come out loving yourself even more. So this breaks down Duck's different phases of the model of relationship breakdown. Of course, there are other ways to look at relationship breakdowns. There's also the KNAP relationship termination model, and we might delve into that in a later episode. But the Duck phases is one of the most common ways in interpersonal communication that we discuss how these committed romantic relationships end. So with that said, that brings us to our latest Ask Dr. Shepard. As I've said before, if you would like to submit your own Ask Dr. Shepard, please feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that email is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So this week's Ask Dr. Shepard comes from Chrisette. And Chrisette asks, "Hi, Dr. Shepard. I've been having issues with one of my best friends of 5 years. We met and hit it off on Twitter due to our shared interests in TV and travel, but lately we've been having a disconnect and disagreements regarding personal issues. I don't want to delve too much into those issues, but it seems as if we're suffering from miscommunication, and I want to know how I can move forward." Well, thanks, Chrisette. I know you don't want to delve too much into the personal issues that you guys are debating, or I guess miscommunicating around. But what I will say is it's common as we evolve and change as people that our likes, our dislikes, our political leanings, our maybe values, our worldviews are going to change. And so what's going to be interesting is to think about, are these just personal disagreements on who's the best singer, who's the best actor, what's the best place to eat, who has the best pizza? Or are these more ideological differences? And so if they are becoming apparent to be more and more ideological in difference, this might then be a time to think about with yourself if you still want to be this person's friend based on how they are seeing and engaging with the world. So for instance, I know for me, I take COVID very seriously. I still do. I follow the science. It's not something I've ever had to my knowledge. I test myself weekly. I still wear a mask. I have, a CO2 monitor. I do a whole lot. If you follow me ever on social media, I'm usually retweeting things about COVID, sharing things about COVID on my stories, sharing updates on me coming back negative with my PCRs or rapid tests. So for me, moving forward, I'm not really interested in any friendships that don't take COVID seriously. So I meet new people, and that is always a barometer for me. Well, what do you do with COVID? How do you take it seriously, or what are your precautionary measures? Clearly, I have people in my life who I have been best and close friends with who don't take it as seriously as me, but they do know that I take it seriously. And so when they plan to be in my presence, they increase their mitigation measures, which I appreciate, even though we maybe have a different understanding or way that we deal with COVID. They love and respect me enough that they will increase their measures because they don't want me to feel comfortable or at odds. I'll even say, I have a friend whose birthday recently was, and we were going to hang out after his birthday, and he was like, "I'm going to go out. Is that okay?" It's his birthday. He can do whatever. And I said, as long as you know that you'll be tested when I see you the next day, that's totally fine. And for him, of course, he got the PCR test, not the rapid test, because I was like, I'm not playing that. So I think when we think about ideological differences, are these deal breakers? And for me, a lot of how I see the world, I don't need my friends to see the world the exact same way, but I do need them to not think about things in a totally different way, right? I would say, I guess I'm a leftist, progressive, whatever you want to label it. So I'm probably not going to be friends with someone that's alt-right. That's just not going to happen. I mean, I say probably, I can 100% say I won't be, because those are just ideological differences that no type of communication is going to be able to fix. Or for instance, the genocide that is happening in Gaza and continues to happen in Gaza and Sudan and all these other places. If you're someone that doesn't see that as an issue, there's no amount of communication that we can work through. So for you and your friend, is it just these disagreements about pop culture, or maybe how one deals with dating or relationship maintenance, or are these deep ideological issues that you're facing? And if they are, I would say maybe it's a time to take a beat and step back and talk to your friend about maybe their changes in views or your changes in views, because maybe you were aligned at once and now you're not. And to figure out, well, where did that separation come from? That can be a really productive conversation. And then based on that conversation, you can see if there are ways to move forward with the friendship. But I always talk to my students that there are friendships for a reason, a season, and a lifetime. So sometimes we hold on to people who are just season or reason friendships. So I know, for instance, I had a really close friend in my mid to late 20s who I'm no longer friends with. He was a seasoned friend. And some of my lifetime friends or lifelong friends that I'm still friends with recognize that. I know Dr. Anderson, Janine, recognized that early, and she said a little something, but because she recognized that this was a friend that was beneficial to me at the time, that she wasn't going to intervene too much, and that I ultimately would see it. And I did. And so we departed and moved on. So I think that's what I would say for you. Take a step back and figure out, well, what are these disagreements about? Are these some disagreements non-negotiable things? And if they are, then clearly this relationship needs to end, and we should go about it hopefully in an ethical and effective way, because you have been friends with this person for a prolonged period of time. But if these aren't non-negotiables, how can we first address, how did we get here? And I would say approach that conversation with love. Use I language. I feel when you do this, that it means this, because that also might not be your friend's intention. And it feels weird using I language at first, but when you continue to use it, it takes accountability of your feelings, which are valid, but it doesn't ascribe your your feelings to that person. That might be what you feel from their actions, but that doesn't mean that's what their actions were trying to do or were meaning to do. So I would say with your friend that you're having these tense conversations with often, take a beat, one, and think about, well, what are these disagreements about? Two, if these disagreements are things you can work through, then let's have meta communication about communication. Let's create a communication environment that will be able to foster a meaningful discussion. If I say, you do this, you do that, someone's going to be defensive. So now you're not really talking about the actual issue, but they're defending their character that they feel as if you are trying to assassinate. So use that I language to have that conversation. But if these are issues that can't be reconciled, then let's figure out a way to create a conversation that lets that friend know that you feel as if you guys are growing apart, that there may be a reason or season friend. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that their friendship wasn't as important or vital to your life. I'm very thankful to my seasoned friend that I let go. I've let go of a few seasoned friends in the last few years during this pandemic, right? We still very much are in this COVID pandemic. And I genuinely do wish them the best, but they just weren't meant to move with me throughout life. And that is okay. So I hope that helped you, Chrisette. You gave me not as much information as the podcast is called, off the data provided. So the more data I have, the better I can assist. But thank you so much for your question. And I hope to hear and see you all on the next one.